Hello, everybody. I am very happy to be here again with all of you. Please feel free, like I said, to use the chat feature if you're just joining in, to share where you're coming in and joining us from. It's been truly amazing to see people joining from all across the globe. I am Petra Rassel, Head of Coaching here at LeggUP. We are a professional development platform helping organizations to transform through development of leaders and employees, more specifically through career coaching. You are joining us today for part 4 of our 6-part series, Thriving from Home. It is our mission to support leaders to rise to the challenge created by COVID-19, and our webinar today is titled True Empowerment. We will continue to support you here over the coming weeks, every Thursday, with topics like learning agility, team mindset, and stress management, as they all pertain to how we can set ourselves up for success while working from home under these unprecedented circumstances we all find ourselves in today. It is my true pleasure and distinct honor to introduce our expert on today's topic, True Empowerment, LeggUP coach, experienced executive coach, mental skills trainer, and transformative learning facilitator, Glew. He is skilled in blending business and psychology in service of enhanced performance and engagement. Doug has developed a strong skill set for translating complex psychological ideas into functional tools that people can use to transform their personal and professional experiences. And we know the two always go hand in hand, leading to enhanced performance and presence. Doug has worked with both domestically and internationally with most well-known companies, and his professional focus and passion is putting the soul back into work. He holds a BS in finance, a BA in economics, and a master's degree in clinical psychology. And without much further ado, I hand it over to you, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Greatly appreciated. First and foremost, I want to thank LeggUP for the opportunity to present on this topic, and I want to thank everyone out there who has decided to dedicate an hour to our program today. First and foremost, the intention of this talk is to help everyone on the talk today to become more empowered. Would really love for everyone to get engaged and become empowered now. Please ask questions. We would love to keep this open and collaborative, because I think we all learn more from each other than we acknowledge at first sight. So let's jump in. I think the first thing I'd like to do when we explore any topic like empowerment is to kind of think about how do we define it? And that's really the first point on our agenda that we'll explore is, how can we really craft our own definition of empowerment, and looking at parallel concepts from the literature and helping you develop your own definition of what it means for you to be empowered. So if you have a moment, please grab a pen or pencil and piece of paper so you can jot down some notes and use that as a way to think. The second idea on our agenda is how can you become more empowered, and we'll start to explore the power of mindsets. This is an idea that you find across the literature in psychology as far as, the lenses in how we make meaning and how we see things. And then we'll explore some of the things that erode personal and professional empowerment, and then wrap up with some ideas around how can we enhance the environment to support our empowerment. So in starting to think about, well, what do we mean by empowerment? I think autonomy is probably, one concept you find in the literature that is a parallel idea with enhancing empowerment. And so a couple ideas here just to help kind of get your mind in the mood to start to think about how can we take from these ideas in crafting our own definition. So the first one from Deci and Ryan, those are the gentlemen who they do self-determination theory. They've been working on autonomy for 40 years, and interesting to note also that, autonomy for them is a psychological need. Just like we have physical needs, we have psychological needs. And so you could also think of empowerment in that way, is we need to have some sense and feeling of empowerment in our life to thrive and flourish and find ways to make meaning. So let's take a look at the first one. The ability to self-govern, acting in accord with oneself, feeling free and choosing in one's actions. The experience of initiating one's behavior, selecting desired outcomes and choosing how to achieve them. A style or method of self-regulation that is characterized by flexibility and the absence of pressure. I like that. I think that would be a good goal. So the second one is a state of integration in which one lives in harmony with one's needs and feelings. So just to remind you that empowerment is not only a way of thinking, it's also a way of feeling and a way of being. And then my favorite at the bottom, that's kind of how I define autonomy, is do you have authority over your experience? Meaning, are you authoring your experience? Do you feel that you have, that you're engaging in a way where you're being creative? So if anyone has anything they would like to share, please feel free to type some things into the chat about how you feel about empowerment and autonomy. A second concept that we can explore too is the idea of will. Will is an older idea that's been around for, hundreds of years. As far as willpower can also be a parallel concept to empowerment, right? Willpower is the capacity to make and implement choices, the culmination of all psychological functions, right? Willpower as the capacity to organize oneself so that movement in a specific direction or toward a goal may occur. Or willpower is control exerted to do something or restrain impulses. So thinking about empowerment definitely has some components of willpower. We want to feel that we are calling the shots in our lives, personally and professionally, to some extent. Oh, excuse me. So if anyone would like to, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in. But I would like to share some of the things that I have learned over the last 15 years. I've kind of been embedded in this literature, is that, if you look at the social psychology and that particular domain of knowledge, we start to uncover some things that, while the dominant kind of belief is that we're self-made, we're independent actors, we're highly socially shaped by the culture and society that we were raised in. And that's good and bad. Some socialization is great, and other times it can be very limiting, and it can start to erode some of your ability to be empowered. And when I say that it can go underground, I mean that we can start to forget what we really want, or in what realms we want to be empowered. And if you think back, a lot of our first actions were actually executed, we were following the will of other people, teachers, parents, you name it. And we did not have much control over the environment in which we were raised for like the first 20 to 25 years of our lives. And we adapt, we do the best we can, and this can lead to less than ideal levels of empowerment unless we start to untangle some of these things. And so the first tool I like to use with all my clients when I'm coaching, I really like to get into mindsets, because, you find this idea, mindset from Carol Dweck's work, or schema from kind of the cognitive behavioral realm, or complex from Jungian psychology, or value structures, this idea that experiences shape how we see the world and how we make meaning. And, you can think about all the thousands and thousands and millions of experiences you've had that have started to shape how you see things. And they become part of our identity. We're not really aware of them unless we take the time to kind of unpack these things. And I think this is one thing that is not highlighted enough, is that this pandemic time that we find ourselves in is a great way to recenter if you're interested in doing so. It's really provides you this kind of new experience where you can kind of become aware of some of the lenses in which you see things and whether or not they're compatible with what's evolving. So just kind of a background here, just to kind of, put this, drive this point home a little bit, is that if you really think about, the first 20 to 25 years of your life, we were all shaped by forces that we had little hand in creating. So you didn't get to control like where you were born. You had no control over your genetics, what family you're born into, what nationality, what era. We're in such a technologically rich environment that people from 30 to 40 years ago, this was not part of their lives and how they, and to think about the metaphors that we live by. There's so much, different ideas around time, different ideas around work. All of these things are shaped by the era that we come into. The educational system, we just don't have a whole lot of control over a lot of the formative experiences. The economic system, work, where you landed on the socioeconomic spectrum, like when you came in, we just find ourselves and we try to make the best of it. So this is a tool. Well, I should probably pause. Does anybody have any questions to this point? Any feedback? Anything from out there in the audience?
I'm sure that we have several that go through all those different values and experiences, and as you so beautifully summed that up in the previous slide, things that really help shape us in a lot of ways that we're not aware of, right, or not conscious of, and they pop up in certain moments, and they either support us in what we're trying to accomplish, or they're really in the way of us being successful with what we're attempting. So that really brings up some specific scenarios for me. I'm sure it does for several of you. Feel free to share some of what pops up for you. In the chat box, we'll be happy to answer it directly. And I can already tell there's a lot more tools that you have here for us to explore that in further depth. I want to remind everyone of Doug's initial question of what is really empowerment, or the definition of empowerment for you. In a sense, who do you want to be right now with everything that's going on? So maybe some of these things inspire you and you come up with your own definition that you would like to share at the end of this webinar. So again, feel free to share what pops up for you here, and we will be happy to address some of that here directly.
So I like to use this tool, and the reason that we use this is we really want to get access to some of our mindsets that have become more embedded. Right? That we don't really even know that we have glasses on, that this is just the way we see things, unless we slow down and start to look at not only what we see, but how we see. So we'll play with this tool. And this is the reason I use it, is because most people, you don't really know how you see in a lot of ways until you get triggered, right? Until an event happens, until we have this coronavirus. And then I was just sharing with Petra beforehand that, you have these, I'm homeschooling my 7-year-old at the moment. And there are these events that come up, given that I've never homeschooled my child, where my father appears in my parenting style. And I'm like, sit still, be quiet. Like, and it brings up all these like, oh man, I can't believe I'm becoming my dad. And my dad was from another time. He was born in 33, right? So you can imagine the parenting that he was, the lessons he was using. But if we can become more aware of kind of how we see things and how we make meaning, I mean, it can really provide a lot of empowerment, because then you're not being colonized by older experiences that you didn't have any control over. And I use this quite a bit with my clients in that, let's play it through first. So rather than events, think about all the experiences, millions of experiences you've had that start to shape how you see things. And then let's reverse it and go the other direction. Then we start to project those lenses onto new experiences. So you want to think about it like old maps for new territory. It can be very limiting. Some of it, of course, some of it's very functional. I mean, you know, we're evolved beings, and this came into being because it works a lot of times until it doesn't. We have old strategies that we used in old environments that we try to apply to new environments with hit and miss type of outcomes. I mean, you know, if you think about applying your belief in value structure around work, and then all of a sudden the coronavirus hits, you have to adjust that or there's going to be some undue suffering, right? We're going to be a little bit on edge, uneasy. And so once again, it's a great time, if we can think of it in that way, is how can we be creative given the environment that we find ourselves in? How can we start to, you know, reprogram ourselves in a way? And I'm a big fan of James Hillman, and I love this quote. It's, you know, ideas we have that we don't know we have us. So thinking about how much has your experience been colonized? How many of these structures do you agree with? And how many of them are just from your experience that you had no control over? And to make it, you know, a little bit more fun, think about this as your imagination. These are like your structures for your imagination. If your imagination is your inner image maker, these things are kind of the lenses that our imagination works through. And then, you know, not only what you see, but how you see. So let's play with this. Let's think about, okay, how can we use this tool, or how have I used it in, you know, my coaching practice? It's really important to think, okay, so how can we get at these things that might be a little bit more embedded? You know, we don't really know we have these lenses. So pay attention to your reactions. What's the belief behind that kind of emotional reaction? And then get curious about it if you want to become more empowered. Meaning that, you know, if we go back to that slide, if you can become aware of the affect, because you wouldn't have an emotional reaction if it wasn't important to you at some point in your life, right? You wouldn't react, it wouldn't affect you, you wouldn't get triggered. But when you do get triggered, if you can slow down and start to think about, okay, what's the underlying belief here? Because every time you react, rather than pausing and responding in a creative way, the script that came about from past experiences will continue to run. And try not to suppress the emotional reaction. Try to express it with responsibility. You know, we talk about, you know, when I coach clients, is like, people get pissed, they get angry about situations. Find ways that you can be fierce. Anger is not something to suppress. It comes out sideways. Most emotions, we get to be an expert at suppressing things when you really want to work on expressing with responsibility. You know, and then once again, that main point, not only what you see, but how you see. How are you making meaning? And then these things are earned through accountability. You have to work through, empowerment is earned through being accountable, right? Are you accountable for the belief systems that are kind of, you know, running how you make meaning?
Actually, Doug, we had a question here that goes a lot into, you know, notice, basically, like you said, notice what you're noticing, right? Notice what shows up. And there's this, how do I become more conscious of my bad behaviors to feel more empowered?
Well, I mean, there's a number of ways that you can start to think. I mean, bad behaviors, I would, you know, think about an awareness practice, you know, whether it's journaling or whether it's note taking, or, you know, thinking about ways that if we want to become more empowered, I guess, you know, to put this in context, how do we become more empowered in regards to behaviors that we don't really like? First thing being is, when that behavior, what is the mindset behind that behavior? let's start, because when you look at the literature, you look at, you know, Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy at Minds at Work, and you know, the mindset is really where we want to start. So what is the mindset behind the bad behavior? You know, and we'll get to this, but I mean, a lot of it's about, you know, rewards, you know, can be sticky territory as far as, you know, empowering yourself.
Yeah.
So I brought along a client example just to show you kind of the power of mindset. I was working with a client he was a rock star. I mean, he was he had 5 or 6 startups. Finally, he had one get acquired by a major technology firm in the Valley, in Silicon Valley. And he was extremely technically talented. But as he moved into this, you know, more mature corporate culture, he was really struggling on a number of fronts. And so he came to me for coaching, and we started to work through that. A lot of the lenses that had formed over his startup experience, right, which is really much scrappier, much more aggressive. There's a lot of, you know, emotions and passions for people who want to start things. But when you bring that into a more mature culture, it can cause a lot of friction. And so we started to work on, because he was really moving from, you know, becoming, you know, being a very high level individual contributor into being a manager and then a director. I mean, and he was moving up, but he was starting to run into some resistance. And so we started to work on, okay, how can we start to change how you see things? And so he was really bright. I mean, he would solve all the problems in every meeting if he could. But the problem is he needed to empower his staff. He needed to find ways where he wasn't a bottleneck. He needed to not be the smartest guy in the room all the time, even if he was, so he could help empower others. And so we started to look at, if you can think about how you see things, this leads to new ways of feeling and being, right? Is that this is even possible. And for him to start to understand that he was now in the business of developing people, of growing people, and learning to successfully maneuver a political landscape. And one of the metaphors we used was that he was moving from being a warrior to being an ambassador, right? He was really moving from this space of like that he had to constantly prove himself while he was in the startup world. And that shaped how he saw things. And now he needed to start to shift because his role had changed, he needed to start to, if he was going to be successful, he had to start to shift his mindsets, right? And he started to pay attention to his reactions and unpacking a lot of old belief systems that were not serving him in this new environment. And it doesn't always feel good, right? This is the main thing I think people, you know, struggle with empowerment issues, is because empowerment, it can bring up some uneasy things. But if you can just understand that it's just old. The reason that there's an emotional piece to it is because part of you is trying to protect yourself and use these old strategies, even though they've become dysfunctional in your new environment and responsibilities. Okay, any questions? Where are we with this? People. How can you use
We got
this?
another beautiful quote here that I may save for the end of the webinar. It's really sweet, from Roman Payne. But so far, everybody seems to be really zoomed in on what you're sharing with us, Doug.
Okay, so let's take a look. So these are some of when we look at environmental hazards, right? And when you spend enough time in the literature, they're always stressing that the environment is very important in regards to empowerment. And in creating, you know, autonomy support is a hot word out there in the OD literature also, is that, you know, when you're creating organizational cultures, we want to have a good deal of autonomy support. We want capacitated people making decisions and essentially doing their own work, right? But the issue is most people have come up in very controlling environments, So you want to start to think about, okay, if you're a manager, how do you start to scaffold people up from lots of controlling experiences to being autonomous, right? To being more empowered. And that doesn't always happen overnight. One of the big things that I focus on, which is a little counterculture, but we can unpack it in a couple ways, is that there's a great meta-analysis of about 150 studies that shows that rewards erode intrinsic motivation, right? And we have to, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, we want to think about, we're marinated in rewards. Rewards are part of what we do. We go for the grades, we go for the money, but at some point we need to answer the question, well, what do you really want? And we're like, well, I thought if I went for the grades and the money, then I'll figure that out later. And sometimes that works out, and sometimes it gets a little sticky. So thinking about one way to operationalize this, right, is like, what are you doing to get through the day right now? Are we really focused on the beer and taquitos at the end of the day? Or are we thinking about how we can, make our day more meaningful? What can we do to be responsible so we come out in better shape after the coronavirus than 20 pounds heavier with some food issues, right? I mean, we want to start to think about how the rewards, and the idea behind it is that the rewards start to control you. Right? We're not thinking about the process. We're just thinking about the outcomes. And the outcomes are much more enhanced when we think about the processes. Another one is too many choices. So when we talk about empowerment and ego strength and, our sense of self, is that choices can really erode our ability to be empowered. And if you look at the talk on, I don't know if this is true, but, I read an article about Jeff Bezos only makes decisions for an hour a day, right? So from 11 to 12, that's when he's calling the shots. And, the same thing with Zuckerberg, he wears a great t-shirt every day. Like, he's got an outfit. And I think it probably comes back to both of them have been exposed to some of the literature around choice. If you're interested in this, Barry Schwartz has a great book, called The Paradox of Choice, is that we really get into this situation where when we're exposed to too much choice, we really lose our ability to be empowered. And so doing some front end thinking about what you really want can kind of, streamline this in a lot of ways. And the last one is controlling rather than empowering environments. So when you think about an empowerment spectrum, empowerment on one end, control is at the other end of the spectrum, right? Start to think in terms of support. How can you support yourself in becoming empowered rather than controlling yourself? And it's the same thing with empowering employees. How can we support them in becoming empowered rather than controlling them? And also, not to unpack too much here, but think about your inner environments. How much are you controlling yourself versus how much are you supporting yourself? How do we start to create inner environments with a taskmaster? We all have that kind of master-slave relationship within at times. And what are the outcomes? What does it feel like? It's a great time to start to develop a new relationship with yourself. And I think this is why we want to become empowered. Or one of the reasons. Any thoughts?
Beautifully said. I think what I could say personally is with the rewards and how we focus on outcomes and the types of attachments we sometimes seem to have to certain outcomes without, as you suggested, really investigating what's driving that, right? What's the motivation, the belief system behind it? And specifically when situations change rapidly, like what we find ourselves in right now in this crisis, is this really still working, right? Or how flexible do we stay in our heads to adjust and play with it and really realize there's space to create, which is empowering, right? Rather than focusing on things that we feel we're not able to control or, you know, have uncertainty around. So that's kind of what popped up for me. We had one of our audience guests here wondering, is it possible, I'm gonna just scroll down here, we had a couple of different entries here. Is it possible to embed your habits so hard that become part of your personality? Basically like building a new me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you start to play with that template, right, that tool around mindset, if you can start to, it's like exercise, for example. We all know we should do it, right? But that'll last about 3 weeks. If we can find ways to really develop meaning-making schemas that have roots. Hey, you know what? I want to go to the gym because I want to be there for my son's wedding. I want to go to the gym because it makes me feel better. Like, we want to think through and really provide a foundation for the mindset behind the behavior, right? Because if it's too superficial or if it's too reward based, it doesn't have a whole lot of depth and traction, right? So we want to look at, you know, anytime you get into like the motivational interviewing literature, you know, they really look at, you know, people have, it's challenging to change and develop these, you know, mindsets that really provide the roots, so you can emotionally root to something, because that's what sustains it in the long haul, right? Is that we really have to, it has to become embedded. If not, it's really rather superficial in a lot of ways. And I think that that's what a lot of people go round and round and round with diets and work and, you know, all these things, because they haven't really taken the time to think through, why am I doing this in the first place?
Yep. We have another question here, Doug. How do we focus on the process of empowerment? I'm so hardwired to think of outcomes only. What steps or tools can I use?
Well, I think the important thing, I mean, the school example is great, right? So we all go for the grades and we don't really think about, okay, well, what did you actually learn? Well, I learned how to execute on tests. What about the whole process? I mean, I was an expert. I did well in school. I was an expert test taker. But there are a lot of times when I go back and I try to unpack a lot of those things, what were the underlying processes, and were they, I overworked a lot of things. I studied things to, you know, where I could essentially teach them and I didn't need to, right? I mean, I overworked and because, and rather than working smart. I think that, you know, in thinking about that, Petra, too, is also, I think there's two sets. It's not that the outcomes are not important, but I think when you look at the processes are as important, if not more important. I think everyone would agree that really well thought out, solid processes that have reflection points built in result in better outcomes. I mean, if you look at the work of Deming and, you know, some of the people, you know, that idea that good processes lead to better outcomes, I think, you know, people could agree on that statement. Did that help answer that question? I'm sorry, I should probably go back to it.
There were specific steps or curiosity around if there's a specific step or series of steps or tools, you know, to use to, perhaps to your point, really focus in more on the process and how do I like to shape the process and enjoy the process, right? Rather than just getting to a specific outcome that may actually, as part of the process, become starting to change, right? In form and shape.
I mean, I think that, first of all, thank you for asking the question, but I would point you to like workflow literature, right? Like really start to think about, you know, a lot of the knowledge thinking that we do in the digital environments we're in. We don't really put a lot of attention on what is the actual flow of our work. And this can lead to, I think it starts to unpack another subject is, the number of distractions in our modern world and how those can disempower you on a number of levels. Is that we don't really have the attention we need to even start to explore some of these things. But really, I love, Kourosh Dini is a gentleman that has written, he's a psychiatrist, but he's also, a musician, and he's an author, and he does quite a bit of work around kind of the deep end as far as workflow, because, if you look at any other manufacturing environment or anything else, they have workflow down to a T, because it results in better outcomes, right? And then when we're in this kind of digital ether and we don't really have workflows, we're just popping from one thing to the next, and we're trying to, juggle multiple projects, and we haven't really slowed down in a lot of environments to think about, okay, how can we create processes that keep us out of overwhelm, right? And also result in better outcomes. Hopefully that helps.
Yep. I think there is even interest, Doug, if we get a chance for you to maybe offer your email or offer a way to get in contact about some of your resources or articles, books that you could potentially share on the topic. I wasn't sure if we had a slide in there at the end. If not, I'm sure we'll figure out a way to distribute that after the webinar. And I will make sure I'll notify everybody as of how we will forward that.
Yeah, and they can always reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Doug Glew, Glew. And I'm happy to share, any of the literature that backs this up.
Yep, that'll be great.
So now let's see if let's move into enhancing empowerment. And I really like to think of, if there's one main thrust of coaching, it's to empower my clients, right? And the work that I do with LeggUP, it's really about, coaching is about being accountable. It's about taking the time to start to think about what is important to you, what do you really want, and why. And this whole idea that Kahneman came up with, a behavioral economist who is, slow thinking and fast thinking, is that if we don't make time for slow thinking, we're really not designed for complex thought when we're constantly busy, right? If you don't make space for this type of integration, if you don't take time to kind of look at what your reactions are, to kind of unpack some of those belief systems, it doesn't happen. We're not designed that way. We're not designed, when we're really busy, we're on autopilot, right? We're using the meaning-making methods that we have that have been shaped over years by experiences we didn't have a whole lot of control over. And, you're going to get essentially the same thing that you've always had. So I like to think about coaching is slow thinking. It's a reflective practice of inquiries that when we can slow down, it really changes our consciousness. It allows us to kind of be more reflective about a lot of our experience. And that results in better outcomes. So I know everyone tells you to meditate, right? We're probably all full of it at this point. It's like, okay, you should be meditating. But, across a wide variety of literature, they're like, if you want to become more empowered, develop some sort of awareness practice. So, but I want to blow up that frame for everyone also, is that, you don't need to become some sort of, first of all, there are thousands of different kinds of meditation practices, but there's also more active meditation practices. Journaling being one of them. We're a busy bunch of people in this modern world, and journaling can be also a very smart way to start to become more aware. And then also, thinking about some of the stuff from John Kabat-Zinn around, mindfulness scans or body scans, right, is another way that you can start to, use these relaxation techniques. But we want to start to work with some parasympathetic practices just so we can start to put ourselves in a frame of mind where we can better reflect on our experience. So I would love to hear from everyone. What do you think? What can you take from this? What did you like? What irritated you? I think sometimes the
Well,
irritants
as you
can
said,
be, a
Doug,
better teacher.
yeah, as you said already, some of these things, when we really start reflecting, right, and that is, like you so beautifully stated, that's really what coaching is inspiring us to do. It's really that reflection on experience and really getting behind how some of these experiences have shaped, right, and how did they come about, and what was the lens we had when we memorize that experience for what it was. It's always interesting. It sounds so simple, but oftentimes we don't realize there's never two people that see the same tree, right? We really do have very wildly different experiences observing the same thing sometimes. But I think we have a couple of responses here, and I'm also curious to see how many of you came up with your own definition of empowerment. I'm going to circle back to that first question, which I'm really curious about. We have here, slow thinking is something we are not conditioned to do. So your views are super helpful. That's probably something that you've heard before, Doug, right? The slow thinking piece that doesn't come easy to a lot of folks. As you said before, we're so distracted oftentimes that we just don't really take the time out to get curious and look behind and beneath the surface.
Yeah, I think one way to think about that too is we have many gears in how we can control our experience, right? And so we want to make sure that we're not always in overdrive. And that can be a regular speed for most people, is that they're moving at such a speed, awareness becomes very challenging. And yet that's kind of where life happens. You know, we lose, when we're moving so quickly, you lose the texture. You lose kind of a lot of the nuance of things. And especially when, you know, emotional intelligence is definitely something I work on as a coach quite a bit. And you have to start to slow down and make ways and find other gears, you know, that there's other ways of being, but they require different kind of, you know, modes of consciousness.
Yep. We have another comment here that's going into your idea around too much choice or too many choices, or, you know, having to constantly make choices. Personally, I really liked your example about making decisions 1 hour in the day. I thought that really narrowed it down in a manageable way. We have a comment here. Most helpful was how too much choice is exhausting. Moving forward, we'll try to reduce amount of choices to make. As this particular guest here in the audience is trying to minimize or reduce amount of choices to make. Also helps understand my kids' unwillingness to be independent or empowered. Too much being asked to make choices. As too many things are being probably presented and having to be making choices about.
Yeah, and limiting, I mean, choice is a great thing, but we want to limit it, right? When you really look at with your kids, give them a couple options so they can choose. They can author their experience. Thinking about, you know, how can we, I mean, if you think back 30 years, 40 years, I mean, the number of choices we make on a daily basis, and don't trust me, I mean, you know, Keegan's got a great book. It's called, you know, we're way over our heads in regards to, in over our heads, is that if you think about how many choices you make on a daily basis versus somebody 25 years ago, it is out of control. I mean, there were no, you know, the landscape is just, and part of the problem is once we've made a choice, then we second guess our choice. Oh, is this going to give me the most utility? Am I going to be happiest with this? I should have chosen the Cocoa Puffs rather than the Corn Pops. You know, all of these things start to boil up, and they really kind of erode our ability to enjoy ourselves. Is that, okay, and it's how can we start to narrow our experience and think about it on the front end so we don't run into that paradox of choice. Is that, you know, we have to back out. Before we had email and all these apps and platforms, and not that I'm a Luddite in any sense. I enjoy the technology also, but how can we start to be more understanding that your ability to empower yourself is limited, right? And choice doesn't always contribute to you being more empowered. One quick thing too, Peter, that you had brought up, one way to also use this tool is, you know, since sometimes it can be a little uncomfortable turning the magnifying glass inward. But if you work with others, and most of us do, or if you manage other people, really starting to try to understand, how do other people see things? And one question I always like to, you know, give to my managers I'm coaching and VPs and others is, if you ask people what is ideal for you, you will run into a richness of feedback into regards to how they see things. Well, it'd be ideal if you just told me what to do. That would be perfect. Well, you know, okay. We know what we're dealing with. Rather, you know, they're obviously a product. They're obviously a product of a lot of, you know, an environment where there's a lot of control happening, which is true for most of us, right? We all want to, you know, that was one reason school was great.
Yeah, it's interesting how that is also getting us into a place where, again, coaching is such a beautiful tool to get the reflection going versus the advice giving, right? Or how Michael Stanier keeps calling it the advice monster that comes out. Just trying to hear, okay, just tell me what to do, just like you just said, right? It's this, no, that's really not what you want. You really want to reflect and make that your answer, right? And your way and your path, and not a formula, right? That may have worked in some instances and not so great in others.
And it's a great point too, though, but that's the way we've been shaped. Like one great thing about school is they tell you, okay, you need to do this, this, and this, and the test is going to be on this. And then when we get out into the work world, you know, for the first, you know, chunk of our career, we're also told what to do. And then at some point, guess what? You need to think for yourself, and you need to, you know, be creative and engage and really learn to dance. And that's another skill set. I mean, that's one thing I think that, I help clients do on LeggUP is that, you know, hey, really get them to understand that there's this creative action that we want to start to enable within people so they can dance with what is, you know, like the reality is unfolding right in front of you. And are you using old maps to engage it, or are you being creative in what's happening? Because that's really, I think, where, you know, the fusion starts to happen, where you start to see some action, is when people can really be with the moment and deal with what is on hand rather than, you know, using some strategy from an old experience.
Yeah. We have another interesting question. Are you finding the pandemic is creating more people pause and be more open to this change mindset of slow thinking for empowerment?
If they empower themselves in that way. You know, we have to watch, like, none of us have ever had this experience. And so we're all trying to find ways to make meaning of it, because the world's going to be a different place for a little while, you know, and we have to think about, some people definitely, you're starting to read that people start meditation practices. They find, you know, new ways to develop awareness. For me personally, I think that this has just taught me how delusional I was about time. Like, I thought, like, once this hit, I was like, oh, I've got all these books I'm going to catch up on. I've got all this reading. And then I realized, like, I've been trying to do way too much for way too long. And I think that's kind of the, you know, opinion of a lot of, and so I had to do my own process around, okay, what is important? What do I need to focus on during this time? Because I think there's an overwhelming sense also that we can't ignore that this is a tragedy. And, you know, how do we find ways to grieve responsibly for this situation and stay safe and really look at this is, there's a lot of suffering happening from this event. And how do we find ways to be aware and be responsible. I mean, it's challenging. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I never thought that I would live through a pandemic. I thought that I thought modern science would have, figured this out. So I think it
Yeah.
can, if you empower yourself that you want to make meaning, use this time to, enhance your meaning making capacity. I think it's excellent.
And I think too, just because you said we're all still coming to grips and we're all still trying to figure out how do we want to emerge from this, right? I mean, we also got to be more maybe realistic when we talk about empowerment, and particularly as it leads or translates for many, having people working remotely now into being productive and effective and being, positively spirited in what they do by finding a new personal why and put the meaning back into the work. Is to be reasonable with our expectations and what that really can look like. Like you said, right? You had all this idea of all the time that you had for things that may or may not happen at the moment, right? Because how could we possibly foresee where the time is going to have to be spent on? And I think you brought a beautiful example earlier about homeschooling. That's probably something that a lot of parents didn't think about at the beginning of the year. Particularly for such a long stretch. We have another really interesting question here. How do you guide clients not to aspire to the ideal? All things considered, of course, at the moment.
Oh, to guide clients not to aspire to the ideal. Well, I mean, I would think about, everybody's there's an ideal, and then there's your ideal, right? So, and where can we start to, where do those things meet? I try to get my clients just to pay attention to their experience, right? I mean, there's a great quote from, I forget his name now, but you don't want to should all over yourself. All the ideals and all the things that we should do, right? And it's like, let's not should all over ourselves. So really coming up with your own ideal. And that's a problem because, once again, a lot of our experiences, we want what we're supposed to want. And we haven't really spent the time kind of unpacking, well, what do you enjoy? When are you at your best? How can we shape our lives in a way that it really enhances our experience? Because once again, I really try to bring people back to their experience, right? Like paying attention to your experience will give you more data than you can possibly imagine. And it really gives you a great deal of insight of when you're thriving, when you're flourishing, when you feel empowered, when you don't feel empowered, right? But it comes from your experience. But a lot of times we stuff our experience. We're like, no, I'm going to pay attention to the ideal. This is the way I should feel. And that doesn't always work out well.
Well, another thing that comes up with empowerment too is, the idea of being able to celebrate small wins, right? That's empowering. I mean, accomplishing something. And I think we also want to stay mindful perhaps of how can we celebrate smaller wins? How do we get to those? And specifically, how do we inspire and empower others to recognize those throughout the day, right? And really help and support themselves better to get a sense of success and empowerment, even though it may look differently than it may have looked for several people, 4 weeks ago. So I think that's maybe another way to move off of these sometimes very ambitious things that we're still trying to reach, and be a bit more mindful, what like you said, what our environment is in a inside and outside, right? Is it supporting us, and do we have some realistic goals set for ourselves, and what are those based upon?
Yeah, I mean, Petra, as you talk to, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No. I was actually getting ready to pass it back on to you.
I mean, another thing to think about rather than focusing on the ideal and the outcome and what you want to do is using this time where we're in lockdown in most states, is to think about energy management more than time management, right? So this whole thing, concept that I think Jim Lohr came up with around, the corporate athlete, and like really paying attention to like, when are you paying attention to your experience? When do you have your best hours? Slowing things down, because we push ourselves through. It doesn't matter, like load up on the triple cappuccino and charge through whatever needs to happen, versus like, no, we have biorhythms. We have, just like sleep cycles, you have awake cycles, and start to get back into some of that literature around really paying attention to when you think best, because we're not always at our best. And if we can start to work with those cycles to put ourselves, once again, to create the internal and external environment that really helps empower us. Like when you have challenge, when hey, I have we get about 6 to 7 hours of really A grade thought, right? After that, it really slips to B and then C grade. So how are you using the best hours of your day on kind of mindless, email responses? Or are we using that as a way to be like, engaging more challenging things? I mean, it's another thing you can start to look at as far as, developing more functional awareness practices at home during this time, is just watch pay attention to how you're feeling, your experience, and start to take some notes on that. You may find, hey, I don't, between 2 and 5 is not a great time to make decisions. I mean, this is the siesta hour. I mean, there's a reason that, cultures have had that for a long time. And there's some pretty scary research out there that, you don't really want to go to court after 2 o'clock. So you'll see that there's a lot of interesting things about where people's decision-making and their thought processes and everything that happens are deeply intertwined with our biology. And we are rhythmic creatures. And so trying to, pay attention in that way.
Yeah, I love that. Doug, I'm thinking we have a lot of interest into some of the resources that you've mentioned throughout. I'm sure we find a way to distribute this to all our registered guests here today in a follow-up email. I will touch base with you on that and collect that.
Yes.
I also want to mention here, as we're wrapping up, that we are continuing our Thriving from Home series here every Thursday. Our next webinar here at, I can say, same place, same time, is going to be learning agility. Another expert of our LeggUP coach community will speak on the topic of complexity and learning agility. And I want to thank everyone for participating today. I think we had a beautiful conversation here, and Doug, tremendous insight. I cannot thank you enough for preparing this for us today. I hope it was helpful and inspired some thought around really how do we empower ourselves and others. Very important for everyone to maybe spend some time thinking around. And on that note, again, want to thank everybody. Please do pay attention to our follow-up page here. When you log out of the webinar, we will actually present to you, fresh out of LeggUP Labs, our Career Pulse assessment for you to take a look at, fill out, try out. It will produce a report in, I believe, under 10 minutes. So it's going to be an interesting little experience just to see where you're at, get a snapshot of where your productivity and your overall well-being is currently at, and maybe gives you another little food for thought here. Again, thanks for everyone joining us today on this really, truly empowering hour. Thank you, Doug. And with that, I want to say goodbye to everybody and hope to see you again next week.
Thank you very much.